Somewhere beneath your feet, right now, there is darkness. Not the darkness of a room with the curtains drawn, or the darkness of a street at night with the lamps off. Something older than that. Something that has never, in all the time it has existed, been touched by light. Caves. They are there under the fields and under the forests and under the oceans and under the mountains, hollow spaces in the rock that have been forming, quietly and without any hurry at all for millions of years. Some of them are small, just a gap in the hillside, a narrow passage that a person could squeeze through if they were patient about it. Some of them are vast, chambers so large that entire cathedrals could fit inside them, with room to spare, the ceiling lost somewhere in the dark above. They are one of the quietest things on Earth. And tonight we're going to drift down into them, slowly, the way water drifts. We are going to follow the process that makes them, the long, unhurried conversation between water and stone that has been going on since long before there were any human beings to notice it. There is no urgency to this. The caves themselves have been waiting for millions of years. They can wait a little longer while we find a comfortable position and let our breathing slow. To understand how caves form, you have to begin with rain. Not the rain that falls tonight necessarily, though that rain is part of it too in its small and patient way, but rain in general, rain as a concept. The way water falls from clouds and lands on the earth and begins immediately to move. Water is a remarkable substance. It seems so simple, clear and cool and yielding, taking the shape of whatever contains it. But water is also, over time, one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Not because it is strong in the way that a hammer is strong, or hard in the way that a stone is hard, but because it is persistent, because it keeps moving, keeps finding the lowest point, keeps working on whatever is in its way, and it has all the time in the world. When rain falls on land, some of it runs off the surface, into streams and rivers, moving downhill toward the sea. Some of it soaks into the ground, and it is this second portion, the water that goes down rather than across, that concerns us tonight. As water sinks into the soil and through the upper layers of the earth, something happens to it. It picks up carbon dioxide, from the air in the soil, from the decomposition of plant matter, from the breath of the countless small organisms living in the earth beneath your feet. Carbon dioxide dissolves in water to form a weak acid, carbonic acid. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would burn or sting, just a very mild acidity, a slight sharpness that the water carries with it as it continues to move downward. The soil through which the water moves is itself a whole world. A handful of healthy soil contains more living organisms than there are human beings on Earth. Bacteria and fungi and tiny invertebrates, and the microscopic threads of mycelium connecting root systems across acres of forest floor. The water moves through all of this, absorbing its carbon dioxide, picking up its chemistry, becoming slightly more acidic with each centimetre it descends. It passes through the root systems of trees, which have their own chemistry, their own acids, their own contribution to the slow alteration of the water. It passes through layers of clay and sand and gravel, each one filtering it slightly, changing it slightly. By the time it reaches the solid rock below, it is no longer quite the same water that fell from the cloud. It has been changed by everything it has moved through. And then the water reaches rock. Not just any rock. The kind of rock that matters most to the story of caves is limestone, a sedimentary rock made primarily of calcium carbonate, the same stuff that makes up seashells and coral and chalk. Limestone forms in shallow, warm, ancient seas, layer by layer, over millions of years, from the compressed remains of marine creatures whose shells and skeletons settled to the seafloor and slowly, slowly became stone. Much of the land beneath our feet was once underwater. The limestone under the hills of Kentucky, which contains some of the longest cave systems in the world, was laid down in a shallow tropical sea more than 300 million years ago. The limestone under the Dinaric mountains of Slovenia and Croatia was once an ancient seabed, warm and teeming with life. The rock remembers the sea, even when it is now high and dry and covered in forest. If you find a piece of limestone and look at it closely, really closely, with a magnifying glass if you have one, you can sometimes see the outlines of the creatures it was made from. Small shells, compressed and mineralized, their original shape still faintly preserved in the grey stone. You're holding in your hand something that was once alive in a warm, shallow sea, in a world so different from this one that the continents were in completely different positions and the animals in the ocean were nothing that exists today. There is something quietly astonishing about that, about the way the Earth keeps records of itself in its rock, layer by layer, year by year, era by era, and the way those records are readable if you know how to look. Limestone is also notable for being relatively soluble, for being the kind of rock that yields to acid that can be slowly eaten away by water that is only mildly acidic, that over sufficient time will give way and open and hollow itself out into the forms we are exploring tonight. Other rocks, granite, basalt, sandstone, are more resistant. Water moves over and through them but dissolves them far more slowly, and the caves that form in them are rarer and generally smaller. It is limestone that gives us the great cave systems of the world, the enormous underground networks that stretch for hundreds of kilometres beneath the surface. And when the mildly acidic rainwater meets limestone, something begins. The acid in the water reacts with the calcium carbonate in the rock. This is a chemical reaction, the kind that happens everywhere in nature all the time without fanfare. Carbonic acid plus calcium carbonate produces calcium bicarbonate, which dissolves in water and is carried away. In practical terms, what this means is that the rock dissolves. Very slowly, imperceptibly slowly by human standards. A millimetre of limestone might be dissolved away over 1,000 years. You would not notice it happening. You could watch for a lifetime and see nothing. But time, in geology, is not measured in lifetimes. The water finds the weaknesses in the rock first, the small cracks and joints and fractures that every rock contains, the places where the stone is slightly less solid, where two layers meet, where an ancient fault line runs. It seeps into these cracks and begins its quiet work. It widens them, fraction by fraction, year by year, century by century. The water is in no hurry. It has been doing this since long before there were mountains here, since long before there was a here at all. It will still be doing it long after everything we know has changed beyond recognition. Imagine a single crack in the limestone, hairline thin, invisible almost, running diagonally through the rock. Water finds it. Water always finds the crack. It seeps in and begins to dissolve the calcium carbonate on either side of the crack, widening it by a fraction. More water follows, because water follows the path of least resistance, and the slightly wider crack is now slightly easier to flow through than the surrounding rock. The crack widens further. More water, more dissolving, more widening. This is how a cave begins, not with drama, not with an earthquake or an explosion, but with water and patience and the slow chemistry of acid on stone. The process is called karstification, from the karst plateau of Slovenia and Croatia, where this kind of landscape was first studied systematically by geographers in the 19th century. A karst landscape is one shaped by the dissolution of soluble rock, riddled with sinkholes and disappearing streams and underground rivers and caves. It looks, from the surface, like ordinary countryside, hills and fields and forests and streams, but underneath it is hollow in ways that are not visible from above, threaded through with passages and chambers, a secret architecture that the water has been building for millions of years. Standing on a karst plateau and knowing what lies beneath you gives the ground a slightly different quality, a slight sense of the depth of things. The way the earth is not solid all the way down, but layered and complex and full of spaces that the surface does not reveal. The features of a karst landscape have their own vocabulary, another set of gentle, specific words for things that most people have no occasion to name. Dolens are circular depressions in the surface, formed when the cave roof collapses or when the ground above a dissolving passage subsides. They appear in fields and forests as bowls in the ground, grass-lined, sometimes filled with water, sometimes dry, their circular shape the only clue to what lies beneath. Polgers are large, flat-floored basins, sometimes kilometres across, that flood seasonally when the underground drainage cannot keep up with the rainfall. Whole valleys that become shallow lakes in winter and return to farmland in summer, the water vanishing back underground when the rain eases. Disappearing rivers are common in karst. rivers that flow normally for some distance, then simply vanish into the ground, swallowed by a cave entrance called a swallow hole or a sink. The river continues underground, unseen, and may travel for tens of kilometers before re-emerging as a spring somewhere further down the valley. In the Dinaric karst, some of the most famous rivers in the region behave this way. The Trebishnjica in Bosnia, which is one of the longest disappearing rivers in Europe, sinking into the karst and travelling underground before emerging as springs near the coast. There is something enchanting about a river that disappears. You can stand at the edge of the swallow hole and watch the water slide over the rock and vanish, and know that it is still there, still moving, somewhere in the dark below your feet, following passages you cannot see toward a destination that may be many kilometers away. Over thousands of years, the crack becomes a passage. Over tens of thousands of years, the passage becomes a tunnel. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the tunnel becomes a chamber. And all of this happens in complete darkness, in complete silence, far below the surface of the world where nothing lives and nothing watches, and time moves at a completely different pace from the one we are accustomed to. In many cave systems, underground rivers run through the passages, real rivers, with current and depth and the sound of moving water, flowing through the dark along channels carved by millions of years of dissolution. They disappear into the ground at one point on the surface and emerge again somewhere else, sometimes kilometers away, having travelled entirely underground through passages that no surface feature gives any hint of. In the karst landscapes of the Dinaric Alps, rivers vanish into the ground at one valley and reappear as springs further down, having passed through the limestone in routes that were not understood for centuries. Local people knew that the rivers disappeared and reappeared. They had known it for as long as they had lived there. But the underground path between the 2 points was invisible and unmappable, until modern cave exploration made it possible to follow them. Hydrologists sometimes trace these underground rivers by introducing dye into the water at the point where it disappears and watching for it to emerge at the springs. The dye moves through passages that have never been entered by any human being, finding its way through a three-dimensional maze in the rock and emerges days or weeks later, faintly staining the spring water, proof that the connection exists, evidence of a route through the darkness. The caves of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, a vast underwater cave system called the Sistema Sacactun, stretch for more than 350 kilometers through the limestone bedrock beneath the jungle. They took millions of years to form. Human divers discovered them only in the past few decades, moving through tunnels that had never been seen before, in water so clear it is almost invisible, their torches illuminating formations that had been growing in the dark since before our species existed. Imagine being the first person to swim into a tunnel like that, to point your torch at a wall and see something that no human eye has ever seen, to be, at that moment, genuinely the first. There is a particular kind of silence underwater in a cave that people who have experienced it describe as unlike anything else. The water dampens sound, the stone absorbs it, the darkness is absolute beyond the beam of the torch, and the scale of the time that made the place surrounds you like a physical thing. But the forming of a cave is only the beginning of the story, because once the cave is there, once that hollow space exists in the rock, something else begins to happen. The water that made the cave does not stop moving. It keeps seeping through the rock above, keeps dissolving limestone, keeps carrying calcium bicarbonate in solution. And when it reaches the cave, when it enters that hollow space where it was not before, something changes. In the open air of the cave, the water releases some of its dissolved carbon dioxide, and when it does, it can no longer hold as much calcium bicarbonate in solution. And so the calcium carbonate precipitates out, comes out of solution, solidifies, deposits itself on whatever surface the water is touching. It builds. This is how stalactites and stalagmites form. The stalactites hang from the ceiling. They grow from the place where water drips from above, adding a fraction of a millimeter of calcium carbonate with each drip, building downward over thousands of years into the pale, tapering shapes that catch the light of a torch and glow faintly golden or white or grey, depending on what minerals are present in the water. The stalagmites grow from the floor below, from the splash of the same drips, building upward, slightly broader than the stalactites above, slightly more rounded at the top. Given enough time, a stalactite and a stalagmite will meet, will grow toward each other from ceiling and floor over hundreds of thousands of years, and finally, with a patience that is almost incomprehensible, merge into a single column of stone. A column that has been forming since before the last ice age, since before modern human beings arrived in this part of the world, since before most of the things we think of as ancient were young. The growth rings of a stalactite, visible in cross-section, record the history of the water that made it. Wetter years, drier years, periods of warmth, periods of cold. Geologists study stalactites the way dendrochronologists study tree rings, reading the climate of the past out of the layered stone. A stalactite is a kind of archive, a physical record of rainfall and temperature going back hundreds of thousands of years, stored in the dark where nothing disturbs it. In some caves, the stalactites are enormous, columns several meters tall, built from millions of years of patient dripping. In Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, the formations are so large and so numerous that the cave has a room called the Big Room, the largest cave chamber in North America, where the stalactites and stalagmites create a landscape that looks, under artificial light, like something from a dream. Like the inside of a cathedral designed by geology, the columns and arches and hanging formations suggesting nave and transept and altar, without being any of those things. The formations that caves produce have names, gentle, old-fashioned names that the early explorers and naturalists gave them, trying to find words for things they had never seen before. Stalactites and stalagmites are the most familiar, but there are others. Flowstone, sheets of calcium carbonate that coat the floors and walls of caves in smooth, rippling layers, like frozen waterfalls, like the surface of a slow river caught mid-flow. It is warm-looking, flowstone, often cream or pale orange, and it has a quality of movement about it despite being entirely still, as if it remembers the water that made it. Helictites, formations that grow sideways or upward, or in spiraling curves that seem to defy gravity. They are made by the same process as stalactites but under slightly different conditions. The water moves through them not by dripping but by capillary action, seeping through tiny channels and depositing calcium carbonate as it goes, building outward in whatever direction the tiny channels run. The result is strange and delicate and beautiful, like crystal coral, like frozen smoke. Cave pearls, small spheres of calcium carbonate that form in shallow pools where dripping water agitates the surface just enough to rotate them slowly, coating them evenly on all sides. They look exactly like pearls. They sit in their shallow basins, pale and smooth, and they have been rotating there in the darkness for 10,000 years or more. Moonmilk, a soft, white, paste-like deposit that forms on cave walls, named for its pale colour and smooth texture. It is partially biological. Microorganisms play a role in its formation, tiny creatures living in the deep dark of the cave, part of the quiet ecosystem that exists down there, in a world that never sees light. There are caves in New Zealand, in the Waitomo region, where the ceilings are covered in glowworms, the larvae of a species of fungus gnat that produces bioluminescence to attract prey. Visitors are taken through these caves in small boats, in silence, and they look up at a ceiling that appears to be covered in stars. Thousands of tiny cold blue-green lights reflected in the still dark water below. The cave is completely quiet except for the soft sound of water. The lights have been there for as long as the caves, which is a very long time. It is one of those experiences that people find very difficult to describe afterward. Something about the scale of it, the darkness, and then the lights, and the silence, and the reflection, produces a feeling for which there is no precise word. Something between wonder and peace, and the particular emotion of being somewhere that seems, against all logic, to be exactly where you should be. There are living things in caves, not many and not large, but they are there. Pale, eyeless creatures that have adapted over thousands of generations to a world of total darkness. Cavefish, with translucent skin through which you can see their organs. Cave crickets with extraordinarily long antennae feeling their way through the dark. Cave spiders, cave beetles, creatures that have given up colour and vision, things that are useless in a world without light, and developed instead an exquisite sensitivity to touch and vibration and the chemistry of the water that flows through their world. They have lived in those caves for so long, and the caves have changed so slowly that the creatures have had time to change with them, to evolve generation by generation into something perfectly suited to permanent darkness. They are, in their quiet way, one of the more remarkable things on Earth. The Olm is perhaps the most extraordinary of them. It is a cave-dwelling salamander found in the underground rivers of the Dinaric karst, pale as bone, almost transparent, long and sinuous, with tiny vestigial eyes that are covered by skin. It breathes through external gills that fan out from either side of its head like small red feathers. It can live for 100 years. It can go without food for a decade, slowing its metabolism to a pace that is barely distinguishable from stillness. The Olm has been living in these underground rivers for millions of years. It has been there in the dark, in the cold, clear water of the underground passages, through ice ages and warm periods and everything that has happened on the surface of the Earth above it. It moves slowly through its world, following the chemistry of the water, finding the small aquatic creatures it feeds on by detecting the electrical fields they produce. It does not need eyes because there is nothing to see. The dark is not an absence for the Olm. The dark is simply the world. The cave itself supports a food chain of sorts, bacteria that derive energy from chemicals in the rock rather than from sunlight, tiny invertebrates that feed on the bacteria, larger invertebrates that feed on the smaller ones, and at the top of it something like the Olm, moving through the water in the dark, the apex of an ecosystem that has never seen light. Not all caves are formed by acidic water dissolving limestone. There are other kinds, formed by other processes, and each of them has its own character, its own atmosphere, its own particular quality of silence. Lava tubes are formed when lava flows from a volcano, and the outer edges cool and harden into a crust, while the hot lava inside continues to flow. When the eruption ends and the remaining lava drains out, it leaves behind a tunnel, smooth-walled, sometimes enormous, running for kilometers underground. Some lava tubes are still active, with lava flowing through them even now. Others have been cold and empty for thousands of years, their walls still showing the flow marks of the rock that once moved through them, like a slow and fiery river. There are lava tubes on Hawaii that you can walk through, ducking your head under the low ceiling, your footsteps loud in the silence. The walls are dark, basaltic black, sometimes with a faint iridescence where minerals have crystallized in thin films on the surface. It is a different kind of cave from a limestone one, rawer, younger, less decorated, without the patient formations of calcium carbonate. But there is something in the atmosphere of it, the same atmosphere, the same sense of being inside the earth, of the rock pressing in on all sides, of time operating on a different scale than the one outside. The longest lava tube in the world is Kazumura Cave, also in Hawaii, running for more than 65 kilometers through the basalt of the Big Island's eastern slopes. It was formed by lava flows from Kilauea volcano perhaps 500 years ago, young by cave standards. You could walk its length in a day, moving through the dark in the footsteps of lava that moved this same passage centuries ago. The walls around you the exact shape of that flow, preserved exactly as the lava left it. Sea caves form where waves pound against cliffs, the mechanical force of water and sediment, and the relentless rhythm of the sea gradually excavating chambers in the rock face. They are often beautiful from the outside, framed by the sea, the water green and churning at their entrances. Inside they can be extraordinary. The sound of the sea amplified and strange, the light filtering in from the entrance and falling on wet walls, the smell of salt and seaweed and deep water. The sea cave is a cave that is never quiet in the same way that a limestone cave is quiet. The sea is always present, in the sound, in the smell, in the movement of water at the entrance that tells you the tide is changing. It is a cave in conversation with the world outside, a hollow space that is shaped by the same force that is still working on it, still deepening it, still widening it, wave by patient wave. The famous Blue Grotto of Capri on the Italian coast is a sea cave, a chamber accessible only through a low opening at sea level, and inside it the light enters not from above but from below, filtered through the shallow underwater passage and diffusing upward through the water, filling the cave with a blue so luminous and unearthly that the first modern visitors, when they were rowed through the entrance in small boats lying flat to clear the low arch, reported that they had not been prepared for what they found inside. The blue of it, that particular, unnatural, impossible blue. Ice caves deserve their own quiet mention, because they are among the most extraordinary environments on Earth. In Iceland and in Greenland and in the mountain ranges of Europe and Asia, glaciers move slowly across the landscape, and at the edges of glaciers, where meltwater runs beneath the ice, tunnels and chambers form. The walls are ice, translucent blue-green, glowing where the light filters through. The formations are not stalactites of calcium carbonate, but stalactites of ice, hanging from ceilings that are themselves made of ice, in a world that is entirely cold and blue and silent. Walking into a glacier cave feels like walking into the inside of a living thing. The ice moves, slowly. The whole glacier is moving, creeping downhill at a pace that is invisible to the eye but measurable over weeks and months. The cave that exists today will be a different shape next year, and a different shape again the year after. Ice caves are not permanent. They breathe with the seasons, grow and shrink with the temperature, and eventually the glacier that makes them will itself be gone, melted away by a world that is warming faster than glaciers can adapt to. The ice in a glacier is old. The ice in the interior of the Greenland ice sheet is hundreds of thousands of years old, laid down as snow in a world that predates human civilization by a great margin, compressed over millennia into ice that holds, in its bubbles of trapped air, samples of the ancient atmosphere. Scientists drill down into this ice and extract cores, long cylinders of ice that read, from top to bottom, like a history of the Earth's climate going back 800,000 years. Each layer is a year. Each bubble of trapped air is a tiny sample of what the atmosphere was like when that snow fell. The carbon dioxide levels, the methane levels, the traces of volcanic eruptions in other parts of the world, all of it recorded and preserved in the ice, waiting in the cold and the dark for someone to come and read it. There is a particular kind of sadness to that, if you let yourself think about it. That these extraordinary blue spaces, lit from within by the sun filtered through 100 meters of ancient ice, are temporary in a way that limestone caves are not. That the ice remembers in its layers thousands of years of snowfall, each layer a year, readable like the rings of a tree, and that those layers are being lost. The blue of glacier ice is its own phenomenon. Pure ice absorbs red light and transmits blue, so thick ice appears blue, a deep, saturated, slightly unearthly blue that has no real equivalent in the everyday colour vocabulary. Photographers who have been inside glacier caves describe spending a long time trying to capture the colour and finding that no camera quite reproduces what the eye sees. It is one of those colours that needs to be experienced directly, in the cold and the silence, with the weight of the ice around you and the sound of distant meltwater somewhere in the dark. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight is not a night for sadness. It is a night for the slow and patient processes of the earth, for the millions of years of dripping water and dissolving stone, for the darkness that has been there since long before we arrived. The longest cave system in the world is Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. It has been explored for over 400 kilometers and is still being explored. New passages are found regularly, connecting to other cave systems, extending the known map further into the dark. The history of cave exploration is its own quiet story, a story of people with torches and then candles and then carbide lamps and then electric headlamps, moving through passages that had never been entered before, mapping what they found, naming the formations and the chambers and the passages in the way that explorers have always named what they discover. The early cave explorers in Europe, in the 17th and 18th centuries, often went into caves for practical reasons: mining, water supply, the search for minerals. But some of them went for curiosity, and their accounts of what they found in the dark are some of the earliest records of cave formations and cave geography. They describe the stalactites with wonder, comparing them to icicles, to curtains of stone, to organs in a cathedral. They brought out samples and presented them to learned societies. They tried to explain what they had seen to people who had never seen such things, and found, as travellers always do, that the gap between description and experience is very wide. The indigenous peoples of the region knew about Mammoth Cave long before European settlers arrived. They explored its upper passages thousands of years ago, leaving behind artifacts, their torches, their moccasins, their tools, preserved by the cave's constant cool temperature and dry air. These objects lay undisturbed in the dark for thousands of years, as perfectly preserved as if they had been left last week. The cave, with its constant climate, its absence of light, its isolation from the seasons and the weather of the world outside, is a remarkably good preserver of things. Explorers in the 19th century found the mummified body of a pre-Columbian man in a side passage, sitting in exactly the position in which he had died thousands of years before. The cave had kept him. In the 19th century, Mammoth Cave was used as a tuberculosis hospital, the theory being that the cool, constant, humid air of the cave might help patients with lung disease. They built wooden huts in the larger passages. Patients came and stayed for weeks or months. The treatments were not effective, and the experiment was abandoned, and the wooden structures were left behind. Some of them are still there, slowly decaying in the cave's still air, relics of a time when people were trying something desperate in a place where desperate things sometimes happened. Mammoth Cave is now a national park, and millions of people have walked through its passages on guided tours, their footsteps echoing on the stone, their voices swallowed by the chambers. Rangers turn off the electric lights at one point in the tour and let the visitors stand in the absolute dark for a moment. The kind of dark you cannot produce in any other way. The kind of dark that has existed in this chamber since the rock formed around the air. People describe it differently afterward. Some find it frightening, some find it peaceful, some find it both at once. The cave art of Lascaux in France, painted 17,000 years ago, contains images of horses and aurochs and deer that are so vivid, so full of life and movement, that when they were first discovered in 1940 by 4 teenagers following their dog into a hole in the hillside, one of the discoverers wept. The paintings were made in the deepest parts of the caves, far from the entrance, in complete darkness except for small stone lamps burning animal fat. The people who made them went deep into the earth, into the dark, and they made something beautiful there. They mixed ochre and manganese and charcoal into pigments that have lasted 17,000 years. They pressed their hands against the wall and blew pigment around them, leaving the outline of a hand in negative, a ghost of a hand, the mark of a specific person who stood in that cave on a specific night and decided to leave something of themselves in the dark. We do not know exactly why. Theories exist: ritual, communication, the recording of hunting knowledge, the mark of a human mind encountering its own consciousness for the first time and needing to express it. But we do not know, and maybe the not knowing is appropriate. Maybe some things that happened in the dark should stay a little mysterious. Lascaux itself is now closed to the public. The presence of visitors introduced humidity and bacteria that began to damage the paintings, and the decision was made to seal it and build a replica nearby. The original cave is tended by a small team of conservators who monitor it constantly, check the temperature and humidity, and watch for any sign of deterioration. The paintings that have lasted 17,000 years are now guarded very carefully in a cave that almost no one is allowed to enter. There is something fitting about that, something that feels right. The cave keeps its paintings in the dark, the way it has always kept things, patiently, in the cold and the stillness, away from the world. There is something that happens to a person in a cave. Something quiets, something that is usually running continuously. The background noise of light and colour and movement and weather, and the sense of the open sky above you, goes still. The cave is constant. The temperature is constant year-round. The air is still. The darkness, when the light is off, is total. Cavers, people who explore caves as a practice, as a passion, often describe a state that comes over them deep underground. A particular quality of attention. The outside world recedes. Whatever was worrying them before they went in loses its grip. There is only the cave, and the next passage, and the light of the headlamp on the wet stone, and the sound of water somewhere in the dark. The temperature of a cave is remarkably stable. In a limestone cave of any significant depth, the temperature stays close to the average annual surface temperature of the region above it, typically somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius in temperate climates, cool and even, the same in summer as in winter. Early humans would have known this. They would have used caves for shelter, not just because they provided walls and a roof, but because they provided constancy, a place where the extremes of the surface world, the bitter cold of winter and the heat of summer, could not reach. The sound in a cave is its own experience. In a large chamber, sound behaves strangely. Voices echo in ways that are difficult to predict. The drip of water amplifies and multiplies. Your own footsteps come back to you from unexpected directions. In smaller passages, the stone absorbs sound and the silence becomes dense and close. Deep in a cave, far from the entrance, in a passage where no water flows and nothing moves, the silence is as complete as the darkness. Both are total, both are absolute. Some caves are famous for their acoustics. Researchers have noted that many of the paintings in decorated caves are located in exactly the passages where the acoustics are most remarkable, suggesting perhaps that the people who made them were drawn to those spots not only for their visual qualities, but for the way sound moved in them. That the paintings and the music and the ritual, whatever it was, were all part of the same experience. We will never know for certain. But the idea of people standing in a painted cave 17,000 years ago, their small lamps casting warm light on the animals on the walls, making sounds that the cave gave back to them in altered and amplified form, is one of the more vivid windows into a mind we can otherwise barely imagine. What we do know is that the urge to go into the cave is very old, that people have been drawn to that threshold, where the light ends and the darkness begins, where the weather stops and the constant cool begins. For as long as there have been people, something in us responds to it, something recognizes it. The cave is dark and still and quiet, and in it time moves differently, and the world outside goes away, and there is only the slow drip of water and the gradual building of things that will outlast everything. There is a cave in the south of France called the Grotte Chauvet that contains paintings made 36,000 years ago, older than Lascaux by nearly 20,000 years, made by human hands in a time so remote that the world outside the cave would be almost unrecognizable to us. Mammoths and cave lions and woolly rhinoceroses move across its walls, painted with a skill and confidence that surprises researchers who study it. There is nothing crude or tentative about the images. They are the work of people who knew what they were doing, who had a tradition of doing it, who understood the cave wall as a surface and knew how to use it. 36,000 years those paintings have been in the dark. The cave was sealed by a rock fall about 20,000 years ago and reopened only in 1994, when a team of spelunkers noticed a draft coming from beneath a pile of rocks and began to dig. The paintings were as fresh as if they had been made the previous week. The cave had kept them perfectly. The footprints of a child were preserved in the floor of one of the passages. A child who walked through that cave 26,000 years ago in torchlight, surrounded by the painted animals on the walls. The footprints are still there. The cave kept those too. The cave does not know you are there. That is perhaps the most important thing about it. The stalactite growing from the ceiling, adding its fraction of a millimetre this year, as it has been doing for 100,000 years, is not aware of your presence. The water moving through the limestone above, dissolving its way through cracks that have been widening since before your country had a name, does not know you are standing beneath it in the dark. The cave existed before you. It will exist after you. In geological time, the entire span of human civilization, all the cities and the languages and the wars and the art and the music and the bread and the arguments about borders and the careful preservation of clay tablets and the building of the Great Wall and the invention of the printing press and the moon landings, all of it fits into a sliver of time so thin that the cave would not notice it. And there is something deeply restful about that. Not diminishing, not the thought that nothing matters, which is a cold and unhelpful thought. But the other thing, the gentler thing, the thought that the earth is very old and very patient and very quiet in its depths, and that the processes that shape it are slow and steady and indifferent and beautiful. There is a concept in geology called deep time, the vast spans of time that geology deals in, so far beyond the scale of human experience that they require a conscious effort to hold in the mind. Millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. The age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years. The limestone in which most caves form took hundreds of millions of years to accumulate on ancient seafloors. The caves themselves take millions of years to form. Human beings have existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Written history covers perhaps 5,000. The industrial age is less than 300 years old. In the context of deep time, everything that has ever happened to human beings, every war, every discovery, every city built and abandoned, every language born and died, fits into an interval so brief it would not register on a geological timeline. This is not a cause for despair, it is, if anything, a cause for a particular kind of calm. The cave was here before us, it will be here after us. The water will keep finding the cracks, the stalactites will keep building millimetre by millimetre in the dark. None of this requires our attention or our participation. It simply continues, patiently and without urgency, the way the best things do. The water finds the crack widens, the passage forms, the chamber opens, the water drips from the ceiling and deposits its fraction of calcium carbonate, and a stalactite grows, downward, toward a stalagmite growing upward to meet it, and in 100,000 years they will touch, and no one may be there to see it, and that is fine. That is more than fine. That is the way the Earth has always worked in the dark without an audience, patiently and without any hurry at all. The cave systems of the world are still largely unexplored. The total length of mapped cave passages on Earth is perhaps 500,000 kilometres, a figure that sounds enormous until you consider the volume of limestone bedrock beneath the continents and the likelihood that only a small fraction of what exists has been found. Every year, cavers in remote limestone regions discover new passages, new chambers, new formations that no human eye has ever seen. They squeeze through openings barely wide enough to pass a body through, emerging into spaces that are sometimes vast, sometimes intimate, always extraordinary. In 2009, a team of Chinese and American explorers discovered a chamber in Wangdong Cave in Chongqing, China, that was large enough to contain its own weather system. Clouds formed inside the chamber, which was so vast that the far walls were invisible from the entrance. A cloud, inside a cave. The rock ceiling lost in darkness and mist above, the floor stretching away into the dark below, and somewhere in the middle of that space, a cloud drifting in the cool, still air. This is the kind of thing the Earth keeps in its dark places. The kind of thing that has been there, quietly, while everything else was happening on the surface. You're on the surface of that Earth right now, in your warm room, with the light off perhaps, or nearly off. Somewhere beneath you, not directly beneath you necessarily, but somewhere, there is limestone and water and the slow chemistry of acid on stone, and passages that have been widening for thousands of years, and chambers that have never been entered by any living thing, and stalactites that have been growing since before your civilization began. The cave is there. It has always been there. It will go on being there, growing slowly, changing slowly, in the dark and the cool and the silence, while everything on the surface comes and goes. Think of the things that have happened on the surface of the Earth while a single stalactite has been building. Empires have risen, empires have fallen, languages have been born and have died without leaving any trace. Species have appeared and gone extinct. Glaciers have advanced across entire continents and retreated again. Coastlines have changed shape. Rivers have changed course. Mountains have been worn down by weather and new ones pushed up by the slow collision of tectonic plates. And in the dark beneath all of it, a small formation of calcium carbonate has been growing, fraction of a millimetre at a time, drip by drip, in a silence so complete that sound itself seems almost unnecessary. There is something clarifying about that, something that puts the noise of the surface world, the urgent things, the worrying things, the things that feel enormous at 11 o'clock at night, into a slightly different perspective. Not a dismissive perspective, not the perspective that says nothing matters, but the perspective of deep time, which says, things take longer than you think. Things are more patient than you imagine. The Earth has been doing this for a very long time, and it will go on doing it long after the particular things you're worried about tonight have resolved themselves, one way or another, as things always do. The drip of water in the dark, the slow building of something pale and patient on the ceiling, the Olm moving through its underground river, feeling its way through the water with senses that have no equivalent in the world above. The glowworms on the ceiling of a New Zealand cave, their cold blue light reflected in the water below, unchanged since before anyone was there to see them. The painted horses on the wall of a cave in France, galloping through a darkness that has lasted 17,000 years. The footprints of a child in the floor of that same cave, still there, still exact, still the precise shape of a foot that last pressed into the soft clay of the cave floor on a night when the world outside was unimaginably different from the world outside tonight. The absolute ancient total quiet. You can sleep now. The cave will still be forming in the morning.